Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. Our guest, Leila Al-Shami, was the co-author of Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, and we had her on The Final Straw in 2020 to speak about some of the background of the Syrian Revolution, repression and civil war in that country. She's Syrian-British activist and journalist based in the UK and is part of the From Peripheries Media Collective. I'm excited to have her back on to share some assessments of the current situation in Syria, nearly 1 year since the ousting of Bashar al-Assad's regime, whose family had headed the ruling Ba'ath Party from 1970 until December of 2024. Leila, I wonder if you'd care to introduce yourself further, and thank you for coming onto the show.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. It's good to be back after such a long time, and things have rapidly changed in Syria since we last spoke, so I'm looking forward to getting into it.
So what else can you say, or what can you say about the transitional government under the rule of Ahmed Hussein al-Shara? What degree of popular consent is there to that rule? What is your assessment of the jihadist insurgent leader claiming to have turned moderate statesman and his backers in the West?
Well, I think I'll start with the second part of that question, which is asking whether Ahmed al-Shara has moderated over time, because I think that's the question that a lot of international media focus on. And yeah, he undoubtedly has moderated over time. And this hasn't been overnight with the fall of the regime. It's been a process spanning a decade. You know, we know that he came out of the Islamic State of Iraq, and Al-Qaeda, had roots in Al-Qaeda. He was sent to Syria by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq, and he founded Jabhat al-Nusra, which when it came on the scene was involved in suicide bombings, killing civilians, was involved in sectarian attacks. And by 2015, it was a powerful force in Syria and started taking up some roles at the state. And when it was doing that, it started to prohibit the mixing of men and women. It imposed Islamic hudud punishments and public punishments. And it also cracked down a lot on independent local councils that were operating in Idlib and arrested many revolutionary figures, and including assassinating key revolutionary figures like Raed Fares, who was very active in Kafr Anbel and was a media activist and involved in lots of revolutionary projects. But at some point, Jabhat al-Nusra realized that ISIS levels of brutality were unpopular, and it was responsive in many ways to popular pressure. It broke with the Islamic State in Iraq, which became ISIS, which they fought. Jabhat al-Nusra fought ISIS a lot, and it broke with Al-Qaeda. In 2017, they rebranded as HTS and set up the Salvation Government across Idlib, and really began to focus on service provision and took a very managerial approach to governance rather than ideological. And it broke in many ways with Salafist doctrine. It started to implement much more moderate forms of Islamic jurisprudence, which were much more in line with the local population. The education system remained largely secular, and it managed to gain respect from many Syrians for the stability that it brought to Idlib. And the fact that Idlib managed to develop in that period, even though it was under attack often, but it developed in much more than other parts of the country. I mean, when the regime fell, people from Damascus started traveling to Idlib to go to the big malls there and were astounded that you could use the internet in the street and things like that. It also started building relations with NGOs to help with service provision, the Americans under the first Trump administration, and Turkey, mainly around security issues, fighting against ISIS, etc. So it definitely did moderate. And since it's come to power after the fall of the regime, you know, it's not ruling as a Salafist jihadist government. But for me, the question is not the correct question to ask, because I think the question, which is much more interesting, is whether he is ruling as an authoritarian or as a democrat. You know, this is a guy who gained power through force of arms and declared himself president. There's no real sharing of power. Most of the decisions are being made by militiamen. It's meant to be a transitional government for between 4 to 5 years until elections, and there's very good reasons for that. It will take that time for Syrians to return to the country, to build up political movements and opposition parties. But the question is, to what extent is he consolidating power now? You know, the transitional government has 23 ministers. 9 of them are affiliated to HTS, and the 4 most strategic positions, the Foreign Ministry, Defence Ministry, and Ministry of Interior and Minister of Justice, are all held by militiamen close to Al-Shara. But there are some aspects of it which is more positive. You know, he brought in a Kurd as Minister of Education, a Druze as Minister of Agriculture, an Alawi as Transport Minister, and a Christian, Hind Kamawat, who is also the only woman, is the Minister of Social Affairs. And Raed Saleh, who was the much-loved head of the White Helmets in Syria, holds the Ministry for Disaster and Emergencies. There's a question to what extent these appointments, whilst they're positive on the surface that there's more diversity in the government, are they just tokenistic because the individuals that have been brought in are not really representing any political constituency or political party or movement. They're just there because they are a Kurd or they are a Christian. So, you know, there's been things that haven't gone so well. There was meant to be a national dialogue conference. This happened early on after the fall of the regime. I think it was in February or March. But there was only one day of discussion on like key issues relating to the future of Syria. There was no participation from the SDF or the Autonomous Administration, which represents Kurds in the north. Many people could not participate because the conference was announced 2 days before, so important political figures from exile couldn't return to the country. Also, the constitution was drafted without any meaningful participation, and that's something that's angered a lot of people. And whilst it does have some good clauses, like it protects the rights of women and freedom of belief and protects linguistic and cultural rights for minorities, it's all power is given to the presidency, basically. There's also been no law on the formation of political parties, and that's a key issue because Syrians need to organise an opposition now, and it was announced that a law on the formation of political parties would happen, but until now it hasn't. So I think this is the key question, really. To what extent is Al-Shara consolidating power, or to what extent is he going to allow more political participation and a transition to a democratic civilian-run system, which is what the majority of Syrians want? But you asked about popular consent, and you know, overall, Al-Shara is very popular with the majority of the Syrian population. So, you know, that there's obviously, and we're going to come into it, certain constituencies which are very fearful of the new government. But there's also a big part of the population which is very supportive of the moves that he's taken since he's been in power.
Thank you for that. And to move back to the creation of political parties or like the culture around that, it seems like it would have been difficult, like not to say that people weren't organizing around political ideas and attempting to make change in that venue during that period of time, the 54 years of rule by just that iteration of the Ba'athist Party under the Assad family. But it seems like there's a lot probably between all the displacement, the new generations that have come up under the war or under the Ba'athist regime, that there has to kind of be some creation of the culture of political parties and sort of a finding of a new road towards that multilateralism in Syria, no?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you know, under the Assad regime for like 5 decades, the whole political society was like totally repressed. Nobody could form independent parties or movements. Anyone who tried to was arrested and imprisoned. And then, of course, over the past decade of the counter-revolutionary war, civil society activists and political democrats in particular were arrested and imprisoned, and many of them died under torture, as you've seen the horrific horrific scenes from Sednaya prison and places like that. So the political culture has been completely destroyed in Syria, and it's rebuilding from ground zero, really. And the question at this moment is there an alternative to Ahmed al-Shara? And there isn't really on the political level. I mean, the alternative is other militias, and a lot of the militias are quite radical and extreme in Syria. So my main concern is whether the political space will stay open over the next 4-year period, so people can really start to organise and build political movements and build a political culture and go forward to achieve the democracy and social justice that they've sacrificed so much for.
So just kind of going through some points from this year that I noticed when I was trying to prepare for this conversation. In March of this year, HTS-aligned militia and the Syrian state forces conducted massacres of Alawites, an ethno-religious minority to which the al-Assad family belongs, during clashes in western Syria, killing some 1,500 and leading to the exodus of possibly some 13,000 Alawites seeking safety across the border in Lebanon. This follows the burning of a public Christmas tree in Damascus and an attack last year, and an attack and arson on the Alawite shrine of Al-Qasibi, in which government-aligned militia partook. Can you talk about current philosophy behind HTS and what it bodes for the rights of religious or ethnic minorities and other parts of Syrian society, often marginalized by conservative religious and governance models? You mentioned that there is in this new constitution the protection of freedom of beliefs for various people. So, yeah, I guess moving from there, if you would.
Yeah, I think minority groups are very fearful because of the Islamist background that the current government comes out of. And because there's been some horrific sectarian massacres on the coast in March targeting the Alawi population, and then later on in the summer in the south of Syria in Sweda targeting the Druze population. I just want to focus a little bit on what happened in the coast in March, because it actually didn't start out as sectarian slaughter. What it started out as was an uprising by Fulul, or remnants of the former regime, who were against the transitional government and trying to agitate against it. Security forces went in to quell that uprising, and things got very out of control, and it did turn into kind of widespread sectarian slaughter. But I think some of the initial killings that were reported as sectarian attacks, they actually weren't. It was the case, for example, of Shuja al-Ali, who in May 2012 was responsible for the Hula massacre of more than 100 people. And he was really agitating, following the liberation, stoking sectarian tensions and calling for an uprising against the government. And when he was killed by security forces, his body was dragged through the streets of Hula, and many media reported this as a sectarian attack, but actually it was a revenge killing. And this really links into the issue of transitional justice, because, you know, one of the main problems with the new government is that it hasn't moved on the issue of transitional justice. And that's really a key thing for Syrians. They want to see the old regime, and not only the old regime, but all those responsible for war crimes brought to justice. And until that's really moving forward, we are going to see these kind of revenge killings. But undoubtedly it got out of control. Many civilians were killed. Many women and children were killed. The vast majority of killings of civilians were by the Syrian National Army militia, which is like Turkish maligned militia from the north. But it was clear also that some forces who were clearly part of the general security or part of HTS also carried out massacres. On the other hand, though, other elements of the general security and HTS did go to villages to try to protect the villagers from attack. So it's unclear like how much this was directed by the central government or how much it got out of control. What is clear is that the government said that it would set up an investigation into what happened. That investigation was never made public and was really criticised for not being transparent. But in recent days, something positive has happened in that there is now a trial being held, which includes both Fulul remnants of the regime, but also members of militia allied to the transitional government to judge their crimes and the killing of civilians in the coastal region. So that's really positive. It's the first time in Syria's history that, there's been a trial in which the authorities are implicated and being held to account. But to go back to the original question, I think one of the main issues is not just about HTS ideology, but it's about the sectarian breakdown of Syrian society as a whole. For the past decade, the people who suffered the most under the Assad regime undoubtedly were the Sunni Muslim majority. They're the ones who faced the barrel bomb attacks on their communities, the chemical attacks, mass arrests and torture, being driven from their homes and forced into exile. And they really have this sense of Sunni victimhood, which is now causing this revival of Sunni identity. And this is very problematic because whilst the Sunni majority feels that they've been victimized, also the minorities feel that they've been victimized and have legitimate grievances. So what we're seeing is this sectarian engineering, which was specifically engineered by the Assad regime to produce societal breakdown, is now being carried over, and we're seeing that play out. And, unless Syrians can come together and put their identity politics aside and start working together as Syrian citizens to try and build a secure and safe future, then we're just going to have constant instability going forward and constant conflict going forward.
I guess kind of sticking to the concept of transitional justice that you brought up, I wonder if whether in the diasporic communities or with the folks that are on the ground in Syria that you've been speaking with or hearing from, if there are any sort of like models, methods, or approaches that you have found interesting that you'd want to share with the audience towards the idea of transitional justice. Maybe if you could like kind of define the term. When I hear it, it kind of makes me think of attempts at, as faulty as they may have been in circumstances like Ireland or South Africa, truth and reconciliation processes that have often been facilitated by outside NGO or like UN or third party agencies. But yeah, I wonder if you could go a little bit deeper, if you can, into the transitional justice idea.
Yeah, I mean, Syrians have been looking at different models over the past decade, those that are focusing on transitional justice, and trying to take examples and inspiration from elsewhere. You mentioned South Africa. Also, Bosnia is a very pertinent example for us because of the sectarian breakdowns and the religious divides in the society there. At the moment, there's a big call from Syrian civil society on the international community to really give support to justice processes inside Syria. And I think that's the main focus, that they want these trials to be held inside Syria with support from the international community, support and expertise from the international community. The transitional government has been very slow to move on this and actually released some key war criminals from its custody, which caused massive public outrage. But then also in recent weeks, it's just set up a commission to start discussing with civil society and moving forward on that issue. So there is some hope that things are going to move on that, but time will tell how serious the government is to pursuing this issue. I think the sticking point for the government is that, it's very happy to try former Assad regime officials for the mass crimes that they've committed. But there's also the question of justice for the victims of opposition militia, including, of course, HTS. And I think this is what the government's fearful of.
Yeah, I could see from the position of like stabilization of a state, especially during the awkward period of transition, that this sort of thing could easily move into a destabilizing of that transition, particularly when for a regime to have operated, I mean, let alone the civil war, right? But for a regime to have operated for that many decades, there's a huge amount of the population that were complicit with the operation of the Assad regime.
There have some amnesties given, which I think is totally right for kind of low-level soldiers and things like that. And, but the people who were responsible for directing the near genocide of the Syrian population really do need to be held accountable.
So as HTS took a leading role in the post-Assad period with the backing of many foreign powers, critics have voiced concern about the role of women in Syrian society under HTS rule, considering the conservative religious views of what they might propose as an ideal society. How has the situation developed? What policies have been put forth? And what practices are in place at this point in terms of the rights of women and to participate in social, economic, political life in Syria?
Well, I think at the moment, Ahmed al-Shara is trying to court and to build legitimacy amongst two key constituencies. The first is the Syrian public, and the second is, the Western powers that it needs to help it rebuild the country going forward. And I think it knows very clearly that if it brings in strong Salafist interpretations of women's freedoms, it's going to be vastly unpopular and is not going to be able to rule the country. There were some things that happened, like shortly after the liberation, a media spokesperson for the new government said that women were unable to do many jobs that men could do. I think he gave the example of the Ministry of Defence, and this sparked massive public backlash, and there were protests held by women across the country. There was also another incident where the Ministry of Tourism tried to ban the wearing of bikinis on public beaches, and this again provoked a massive public backlash, and the government ended up saying that nobody is able to interfere with women's dress, and if they do, they will be punished. But, the situation for women is not just an issue stemming from the government. Syria is like a deeply patriarchal and socially conservative society. And even within opposition circles, it's very difficult for women to carve a place and be politically active in many cases. The exception to that, of course, is civil society, and women are really at the forefront of many of the civil society organisations, and particularly working on the transitional justice issue, which is often being led by wives and mothers of the detained and disappeared. There are some very concerning things happening in terms of women's rights, and one of this is reports of kidnappings of Druze and Alawi women, specifically Alawi women. There's been many reports of kidnappings. It's difficult to know how widespread this is, because definitely some of that has been inflated for propaganda purposes from people who are against the new government, but it's definitely happening in large numbers. The government tried to do an investigation into it, and they investigated, I think, 42 cases, something like that. And they said that only one case was real and the rest were fabricated. But this has been widely condemned by Syrian human rights organisations, who said it's the government's not taking the issue seriously.
I'm sure that there are lots of theories coming from different directions about who could be behind these kidnappings. Like, is the idea, like, are there any plausible explanations? Like, is this coming from outside of Alawi communities? Is this coming from people within Alawi communities kidnapping their neighbors? Or, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think a lot of it is revenge, often coloured through a sectarian lens. That's what I imagine it is. People are thinking, these communities oppressed us and collaborated with the Assad regime, which, they're taking revenge into their own hands. And there has to be much more concerted action by the government to ensure minority communities that they're safe and to stop these kind of incidents from happening.
So my understanding is that there was, pivoting, my understanding is that there was a peace deal between the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, sometimes known as Rojava, and the transitional government under al-Shara, in which the Syrian Defense Forces, the SDF, which are dominated by the YPJ and YPG, plan to integrate into the National Army by the end of 2025. But clashes have continued between Ministry of Defense Forces, being offered promises of advanced weaponry by Turkey, who's been very much against the organization of the Kurdish majority in northeast Syria, and also Arab militia that support it versus the SDF and this comes at a time when the USA, like under the first Trump administration, the US was already withdrawing its backing in a lot of ways from the SDF and its fight against ISIS. And during the second Trump administration, this has just gone further and has withdrawn troops.
Yeah, there has been continued fighting in the north between SDF and specifically Turkish-backed militia, the Syrian National Army. The Syrian National Army is well known for its brutality and the atrocities that it's carried out in areas that it controls, and specifically targeting the Kurdish population. There's also been outbreaks of fighting in the areas that the SDF rules where it's not popular. So if we go back to March 2019, the SDF controlled all the territory from which the global coalition had expelled ISIS. And that was not only the Kurdish northeast, but also the almost entirely Arab southeast, including the city of Raqqa. And many revolutionary Syrians were not happy with this. They saw it as a power grab. They saw it as outside interference in their local governance. So the PYD rule, whilst it was a success for many Kurds in areas which had a Kurdish majority, that was not the case in these areas. So when the regime collapsed in late 2024, the SDF captured Deir ez-Zor from the regime and Iranian fighters, and residents protested to demand the SDF withdrawal. And many local SDF units defected to HTS, and the city returned to central control. And in Raqqa, there's still very high tensions. Men who were still under SDF control and men who have raised the Free Syria flag have been imprisoned for like 2 or 3 years for doing so. And there's also the issue of forced conscription. The SDF are forcibly conscripting young men and youth, which is undermining the agreement that the SDF has carried out with the central government. So to return to the agreement, that on the 10th of March, Al-Shara and the SDF signed an agreement to integrate the institutions of the SDF into the central government and national army in exchange for recognizing the rights of all Syrians to representation and participation in the political process, regardless of ethnicity or sect. But when the constitutional declaration came out, it failed to offer any concessions on equal citizenship, decentralization and local democracy, and was rejected on this basis not only by the SDF, but also by the Kurdish National Council, who are opposed to the SDF and have worked with the Syrian opposition throughout the past decade. So, the Kurds felt that their rights were not being taken seriously. They didn't want to give up their arms. And then obviously with the violence that broke out in the coast in March with the Alawi community and in the south in the summer with the Druze community, the minorities are much more fearful and they want the SDF to keep their weapons and maintain a local self-defense force, understandably. But on the 16th of October, there was another agreement between the SDF and Damascus to merge the SDF into the Syrian army. And this time the government said that they could join as a cohesive force. So the Kurds do maintain their own self-defense force. And in reality, then, it means there is some form of decentralization, at least in security issues. So, going forward, I think the deadline is the end of this year. Let's see what the progress is over the next month.
Bringing up the idea of Syrian citizenship, especially after the amount of conflict that's occurred since the civil war began and since the revolution, how does citizenship work in Syria, or how has it worked? Are there populations that were born on the soil that lack documentation or acceptance by either the past or the current Syrian regime in a way that has been held over their heads?
Yeah, definitely. Specifically the Kurdish population. There was an exceptional census carried out. I think, if I remember rightly, it was 1962, but I may have got the dates wrong. And this stripped many Kurds on Syrian soil of their nationality. And because they didn't have their nationality, they didn't have access to their basic rights, either civil or political rights. They couldn't participate politically, although nobody could really. And they were denied a lot of their social and economic rights because they couldn't, for example, go to certain hospitals or universities, higher education. The Assad regime, when it started working more closely with the SDF, because it handed over control of the northeast to the SDF, it did give some of those Kurds back their citizenship, I think, as a way to kind of make some concessions and have more support from the Kurdish community. But I think there are still a large number of Kurds that don't have the citizenship. I don't know. I've not seen any discussions happening on that, and it will be interesting to see going forward if those people are granted citizenship or not in the future.
The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
The Anarchist
Radio Berlin.
From across the pond.
So it's the Anarchist Radio Berlin.
With audios in English, Spanish and German.
And please,
don't mention the war.
You can find us at channelzeronetwork.com and aradio-berlin.org.
If you want to support the Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various streaming platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.media. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce for each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, or LibrePay. Or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.media/support. Finally, if you'd like to hear us on your local radio station, visit tfsr.media/radio to find more info or reach out to us for some help. Thanks for listening. Thank you for letting me just spitball that one at you. I appreciate it. So the Kurdish-led SDF has estimated that there are some 10,000 ISIS or Daesh fighters still active in Syria. And there are an estimated 10,000 suspected ISIS fighters and supporters held in prisons like Al-Hol. Can you talk about the continued attacks by affiliates of Daesh, particularly as the U.S. forces have further withdrawn, the likelihood of resurgence, and the continued incarceration of suspected militants and their families?
Sure. Well, ISIS was defeated as a state in 2019, but since then it has still managed to launch guerrilla attacks and assassinations in eastern Syria, and there have been dozens of those that have happened since the fall of Assad. You know, it once had a force of 100,000 fighters in Syria and Iraq. 40,000 of them were foreigners, and that's really estimated to have gone down to about 3,000 men now, mainly locals who are hiding out in desert areas. But they are trying to rebuild, you know, and my fear is that they will attract many of the men from al-Shara's own base who are disgruntled with the more moderate turn that he's taken. I think that's quite a worry going forward that will happen. And as you mentioned, there's up to 10,000 ISIS fighters and supporters of ISIS in SDF custody, including tens of thousands of women and children in places like Al-Hol camp. You know, many of these youth have had no education. They have no options. Most of them have not committed any crimes. They've just been, you know, unfortunately born into an ISIS supporting household. And all of those foreigners, the issue is what is the international community going to do about it? Because international states are refusing to take these people back. But they're not Syrians. Many of them are foreign nationals. So they should be returned to their country of origin, either to face trial or, in the case of women and children who haven't participated in atrocities, to be rehabilitated. And foreign powers are not willing to do that. There's a very famous case in the UK of a woman called Shamima Begum, who was a UK national, who left Britain, I think at the age of 15, to join ISIS and travel to the Islamic State. And the UK government stripped her of citizenship. So, what's going to happen to these people now? Just sitting there in this prison camp is just a disaster waiting to happen, really.
So this year, you featured 2 interviews on your podcast, Syria The Inconvenient Revolution, with Hossama and Cedric of Interstices Fajawat, who are based in Soweto, to speak about the attacks on members of the Druze faith and conflicts with Syrian authorities, as well as with Bedouin militia over land, ostensibly. Could you talk about some of the topics that you covered, but also just share with the audience some of the insights that you have into this and the status of that conflict now?
Yeah, it's quite, I won't go into all the details of what happened in the summer. People can go and listen to those podcasts and hear firsthand accounts of what happened. But on the eve of liberation, there was a large section of the Druze population that were willing to work with the transitional government. And that's really not the case anymore. And the reasons for that are because violence broke out. First of all, there was a fabricated audio recording of a Druze sheikh insulting the Prophet Muhammad, which was proved to be a fabrication, but this stirred up a lot of animosity against the Druze. There were outbreaks of violence in Jeramana, which is a suburb of Damascus. There were attacks on Druze students, I think in Aleppo and in Damascus. And then in Soweto, things got totally out of control. There was a massive mobilization by Bedouin militias that carried out many atrocities against Druze civilians. There were awful videos that circulated of people being shot simply because they said that they were a Druze, not a Sunni Arab. There was killing of a medic, which was horrific. There were videos circulating of Druze men having their moustaches forcibly shaven, because the moustache is often a symbol of the Druze faith. So things really broke down, and the government failed to establish control over the province and actually sided with the Bedouin militia, which created a massive mistrust amongst the Druze population. And then this Druze sheikh called Al-Hajri, he wasn't popular. The first time that I spoke to Cedric and Hossama for the podcast, we were asking about the different militia groups and what they were standing for. And it was very clear from what they said that the majority of the Druze, those that had opposed the Assad regime, wanted to work in some form with the transitional government. Parts of them wanted more decentralization and autonomy than others, but there was a willingness to cooperate. And Al-Hajri was quite isolated. People didn't like him because he was known for his connections with the Assad regime, and they didn't like him because he started calling on Israel to intervene to protect the Jews from the slaughter that he said was coming, and in effect did happen. But now Al-Hajri has got a massive amount of support from the Druze population because of the sectarian violence that happened, and he's kind of eliminating the opposition of other groups and now ruling Soweto with quite an iron fist, it seems, internally. Meanwhile, there were Syrians who were sympathetic to the Druze at the beginning, but after Israel's intervention, Israel even bombed Damascus, claiming it was to protect the Druze. There quickly became a lot of animosity amongst the Syrian population to the Druze, who began to see them as traitors and collaborators. So, for example, on the 15th of July, there was a demonstration in Al-Hasakeh in support of Soweto. But then after Israel's bombing, there were protests all around the country, including in Al-Hasakeh, calling for support for the transitional government and against Israel. So it's a very difficult situation. The government so far has failed to punish anyone that was involved in committing the atrocities. And after the massacres, rather than trying to help, the government in effect imposed a siege on Soweto, and there were food and fuel shortages. So it's kind of in a deadlock now. And, you know, again, it's another example of sectarian breakdown in Syria, which is going to take so much work on so many levels to really try to overcome if we're going to have any stability going forward.
Yeah, and I guess in relation to the Druze and Israeli connection. Regional powers have been jockeying to expand their influence in Syria since the fall of Assad. For instance, with Turkey increasingly backing armed elements in attacks in the northeast, the PKK aligned with the autonomous administration of northeast Syria, but across the border in Turkey has declared that it would leave Bakur region and disarm and struggle through civil methods inside of Turkey. Israel has taken advantage of the war and the ongoing conflicts. In particular, has been, I think, for a while, sort of courting Druze population that are in occupied Golan Heights around the idea of protecting them from the Syrian state, and at times launching aerial attacks, which you mentioned, into Syria. Do you see these pressures as increasing or significant at this moment?
It was inevitable, really, that when the regime fell, the entire international community would descend on Syria like vultures, trying to set their influence, trying to get what they can out of the country, trying to set the agenda and ensure that whatever happens is in their interests. And that's how so many states have dealt with Syria throughout the civil war, and it's how they're dealing with it now going forward. Unfortunately, Syria is in a very weak position. We don't have a unified country. We don't have a government that's in control of the entire country. You know, during the battle for liberation, Israel actually bombed all the military installations in Syria. So Syria doesn't actually have any advanced weaponry from which to protect itself. So these realities render Syria dependent on international states, and it's building a lot of relations with America, with the Gulf states, and with Turkey, both in terms of trying to get support for reconstruction going forward, but also in terms of resisting Israel, because Syria cannot resist Israel on its own. It needs powerful states behind it. Israel's such a huge threat to Syria at the moment. It's really been expanding its territory, carrying out raids into Syria. There have been videos of settlers going in and trying to set up places for them to live inside Syria. There have been reports of Israelis kidnapping the Syrian citizens from the south. So, it's a very dangerous situation. I don't know what more to say about it. It's a very dangerous situation, and the only thing that we can hope is that Syrians manage to set the agenda and that it's Syrians that are able to make the decisions going forward.
How do you feel about the international media covering the issues faced by Syrians, and do you see much life of independent media on the ground among Syrians?
The international media, as we touched on earlier, has really been quite focused on whether, Syria's now an al-Qaeda state and, whether it's going to turn into another jihadist entity. There's been a lot of focus on that. But then I've also been very surprised by the international media support for Syria going forward as well. Certainly, Al-Shara has been courting international dignitaries, people like Trump, and even things which were very unpopular, like speaking with Russia, but recognizing that's the reality that we're in now. So there has been positive coverage of that. In terms of independent media, I've been very saddened to see that some independent media and independent voices have just fallen into support for the transitional government, and they're not being critical in any way or form, that they're not trying to push forward and hold to account for these human rights violations that are still happening. And then also there's been a problem that when there are critical voices, and there of course are many critical voices, they're also being silenced on social media by supporters for the government. And this is very worrying, that, that democratic space or the freedom to express your views is being controlled not just by the government, but actually by people, including people who were once key revolutionary figures or, supported the struggle against the Assad regime.
So over 54 years of the al-Assad dictatorship and the civil war, many people chose to leave Syria. Many made homes elsewhere. Some likely longed to return. Is it your impression that people are returning in significant numbers to Syria, or are people that you've spoken to taking a sort of wait-and-see approach as the country continues to experience some destabilization and the need for rebuilding?
Many people have returned. I think the UN estimates like around 1 million people have returned to Syria since the fall of the Assad regime. About 1.7 million people who are internally displaced have returned to the communities from which they were displaced from. Many of these people were living in appalling situations in camps in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, so they didn't have good options open to them, and they've returned to a really desperate situation because there are not houses, there are not jobs inside Syria now. But then there's many people as well, especially those who have been more fortunate, maybe have made it to Western states or have managed to get property or have jobs or have their children in school outside Syria, are much more nervous just to give up everything that they have and return back whilst the future of the country is still so uncertain.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess more particularly, what is the economic situation like in Syria in terms of employment or the cost of everyday needs such as utilities, flour, oil, water, fuel, and meat?
It's a disaster, basically. It's a depressing situation. When I went back, I mean, the first thing you notice is the extent of the destruction. If you go outside Damascus city centre, I was mainly based in Damascus, into the suburbs are entirely destroyed, and the cost of reconstruction is estimated at being around $250 billion to $400 billion. So there's a huge amount of money that's needed and investment that's needed to rebuild the country. Meanwhile, 90% of the population are living below the poverty line. There are not jobs, there are not homes. So there's massive challenges there. Food prices are very expensive. Electricity was in very short supply. When I was in Damascus, there was only electricity for 2 hours a day, but I believe that that's really improved massively over the past weeks. But there's been some positive things as well. Certainly the lifting of sanctions was a positive, and people were very happy that that's happened and that there is a chance for reconstruction now going forward. And trade deals have been had with Qatar, with Turkish companies, with American companies to revive the energy sector and various other things. I mean, I think the real question is to what extent there's going to be popular participation in reconstruction and in economic decision making going forward, because, you know, a key feature of the old regime was this kind of crony capitalism, in which all the money and contracts, business contracts, were really concentrated in the hands of Assad and his family and loyalists. And I think this is the fear that a lot of people have going forward, whether the developments that are brought in, the trade deals, the reconstruction will really benefit the most disadvantaged of the population and will actually filter down to people who don't have homes, who don't have jobs.
I guess another part of the legacy of the Assad regime and of the war was the introduction of production and distribution of Captagon, which is a branding on fentanyl. And I know that it seems pretty common that in areas of depressed economic situations, drug trade, drug trafficking, drug use are escalated. I wonder if you have any sort of insights about what's going on with Captagon in Syria at the moment, with the distribution and the usage or the treatment or harm reduction around it.
So yeah, over the past decade, I mean, Syria in effect became a narco state. The Assad regimes, all the money towards the Assad regime was coming from the production and distribution and trade in Captagon, this amphetamine-like substance, which was being exported all around the world. I mean, you would hear regularly every other week there would be massive seizures of shipments in like Jordan and the Gulf countries, even as far afield as Italy. And then, of course, Captagon was very popular with Syrians taking it, especially Syrian fighters. It's an amphetamine-like substance, you know, so it gave people energy, it stopped them feeling hungry, it took away some of their fear of fighting, and many, many people became addicted to it. The new authorities are very openly saying that they want to clamp down on Captagon. They're very anti-drug use. And there have been some big seizures of drugs which were destroyed, and also the destruction of drug producing factories. It's been very public about that. But of course, the trade is still going on. So many people, it's the war economy. People made their living and their money by that, and it's not going to stop overnight. And then just in terms of rehabilitation, I think that's one of the main problems, is how to deal with people who have unfortunately got addicted to this substance, because there isn't that much sympathy for drug use in the population. And I think there are some initiatives which are working to rehabilitate addicts, but they're not as widespread as they need to be.
So I guess pivoting a bit, we've talked a little bit about the legacy also of sectarianism that was exacerbated through Assad's rule and the repression of the Sunni Arab majority, as well as other minority groups within the country, and then the breakdown across ethnic and religious lines and regional lines during the conflict of the Civil War. One of the things that you covered in Burning Country that I thought was really interesting, and that I've seen come out in some of your blog posts since, or articles, was the revolutionary impulse for a new identity of Syrian that would not be drawn along these lines and couldn't be used by sectarian impulses to create conflict, like some sort of like new Syrian identity. I wonder, despite these instances that I've asked you about so far during this conversation, if you see that revolutionary impulse right now in Syria.
The sad thing is that so many people who started the revolution are no longer with us. Many of the Democrats, the people that were working across sectarian and community divides, that were really fighting for democracy and social justice, many of them were imprisoned, killed. A few of them went out into exile and are now able to return. But the movement, as a movement, was almost completely destroyed, and the fall of the Assad regime came by an armed militia that wasn't involved in the original revolutionary movement, unfortunately. I was quite hopeful when the regime fell that we would see a massive revival of civil society. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. There are lots of initiatives happening. There are many people working on the ground, but we can't start talking about a movement. Whether we will see more of a revival going forward. At the moment, the government is very popular with the majority of the population, but, if it doesn't deliver on things like democracy, transitional justice, stopping these sectarian killings and trying to implement much more security and stability, it's going to rapidly lose its popularity over time. So yeah, there is stuff happening, but we can't really be talking about a big movement of opposition at this stage.
So switching topics a bit, I wonder if you'd mind sharing a bit about this project, The Peoples Want, that you're a member of, and sort of how it came to be and what the goals and hopes of this are.
So yeah, The Peoples Want is a network. It came out of the struggles and revolts that were happening primarily in 2019. Maybe it's good to talk about how it started, because that will explain a bit what The Peoples Want is trying to do. But in 2011, there was a massive wave of transnational uprisings. There was the Arab Spring. There was uprisings in Spain, in Greece at that time, in the US with the Occupy movement. And specifically, the Syrian revolution had a massive impact on a whole generation of activists, because people felt very disillusioned that large sections of the left did not support the Syrian struggle and instead took this campist, state-centric analysis where everything was a power game between states and the people were basically invisible. So a lot of conversations started to happen, and especially with the next round of transnational revolts, which happened in 2019. So the Syrian Canteen, which was a self-organized collective in the Paris suburbs, started to ask what could internationalism look like, and started to invite participants from those revolts and revolutions that were happening across the world together to gatherings, to festivals, to start having this discussion around internationalism and how we could really support popular powers during the time of revolt. And that's how The Peoples Want was born. There have been 5 festivals so far, and at the 4th festival, the participants got together and said, actually, rather than just having this yearly gathering, let's actually try to build a network based on principles of solidarity and mutual aid, where we can support each other, we can increase our strength, and we can ensure that the revolts and struggles of the future don't just get wiped out like many of the ones that we've been involved in up until now have. So yeah, that's where we're at. The network was officially launched in March of this year, opened up to membership, some really exciting work going on. But ultimately, it's a space for people to come together and to share their experience, to share their tactics of struggle, to learn from each other and try to build, support amongst ourselves.
Yeah, and I really suggest that listeners check out, and I'll put it in the show notes, but there was just recently a Submedia, I think just recently, I just saw it when you reposted it, but a video that Submedia did with a portion of the text from the manifesto set, as they always do, with some really striking images and video of uprisings. One quote that I was struck by was on page 19 of the manifesto, quote, "Unity is enabled by the sharing of experiences from the margins, insurrectionary practices, resistance in the face of repression, and the organization of immediate survival, more than by visions of change or ideological convictions," unquote. I wonder if you could speak a bit about these margins and the challenge that the People's Want is attempting to face.
So yeah, it's what we realized was that when these uprisings happened, they weren't really going out because of grand ideologies or political proposals. They were really based in the experiences, the local experiences of injustice and lack of socioeconomic justice and repression that people faced at the local level. So the question that we had was to think of internationalism not as putting forward necessarily a new proposal, but thinking about how we can better support these diverse and local struggles which are operating at the margins all around the world, and try to create internationalism based in people's real experience. And of course, the challenges, the reason why we felt this is so important is because we're facing so many multiple challenges going forward, whether that's rising authoritarianism and fascism across the globe, societal and ecological collapse. These are issues that concern all of us, and that in order to be powerful going forward to resist these things or respond to these things, we need to work together.
Because of the traditions and the languages, there's going to be different representations of visions that people do have in different struggles. I think that for me, one of the weaknesses that I saw in the Occupy movement in the United States was having a very broad and sort of undefined set of shared values around class. There was generally this concept of the 99% and the 1%, which is very populist, but it lacked an analysis, I think, for people to cohere around, while pointing at a common anger or resentment or difficulty that people were facing in their lives. And so the manifesto, it gives examples of many uprisings around the world that look different, and that also had commonalities around, I guess, composition around social justice as a concept. And I wonder, in your understanding with the People's Want as a project, what lines are drawn between what uprisings are considered to be ones that emulate values that you want to engage with and work around and find solidarity with, and what are uprisings that don't, or where are values being expressed that you would distinguish yourselves from? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I understand the question that you're asking. I mean, we're not trying to put forward a dogmatic kind of political basis. There's no kind of monolithic or homogenous position, because we come from a variety of territories and struggles. We come from popular feminist movements, from ecology and food autonomy struggles, from autonomous spaces and collectives of exiles. So the thread that weaves us together I suppose, is our commitment to coming together to start asking these questions and to start asking what internationalism should look like based on the principles which are set out on the manifesto. We're working with popular powers, people who are trying to build material and political autonomy within their struggles. So it's not even necessarily taking a struggle in its totality. We're seeing who are people within those struggles that align to these certain values, and how can we support them and give them more strength to grow, because they're focused on building material and political autonomy. You know, they have strong anti-authoritarian vision, etc.
Great. And you mentioned the festivals that you all have put on. I wonder if you could talk about what sort of things happen with that, and if there are ways that people can find out when the next one's happening to try to participate.
So the model for the festivals that we've done up until now is we had a week where we invited participants in Revolt, were invited to come and to discuss together, strategizing in private for 1 week, in which over the past few years we've actually been developing the concepts and the basis for the network. But then we always had a public festival for 2 days in which anybody could attend, where, you know, people involved in the People's Want would have a platform to talk about their struggles. People could learn from people involved in the resistance committees in Sudan, from the local councils in Syria, from struggles in the US. We had people from the US, from Defend Atlanta struggle, for example. So, you know, to provide a forum where these different ideas could get heard by the public at large. And then we also always had a bit of a party on that weekend as well, with DJs, live bands, kind of based in the idea that if you're going to like dance and celebrate and eat good food with people, it will become much easier to work together politically going forward.
I'm sort of reminded of the Zapatistas in 96 had this first intercontinental encounter for humanity and against neoliberalism, which they called the Intergalactic. And it kind of sounds like this sort of two-front event where there's a public-facing side of it that's bringing together people to share ideas that the rest of the world who can't participate or aren't participating can sort of interface with ideas and struggles. And then also the internal facing of like the participants hanging out. I wonder, was that an influence at all, or were there other influences to the sort of model?
Definitely it was an influence. And actually there's just been another Zapatista gathering this summer, and 3 of our members travelled to Chiapas to attend that and to talk about the People's Want and talk about the manifesto. So yeah, I mean, we're such a diverse group of people from so many different backgrounds. There's so many different influences and different experiences to learn from. And we're trying to provide a forum where people can come together and share and pool that experience and see what comes out of it.
Well, that's very exciting. I'll be sure to link in the show notes the website for the People's Want, where people can read the manifesto and also news updates, find further materials. If listeners want to find more of your work, Leila, where can they find you? And are there any projects that you're currently working on that you want to share about?
I have a blog, which I hardly ever write in, which is called Leila's blog. I think it's leilashami.wordpress.com. And yeah, I would encourage people to read the manifesto. I'm very involved with the People's Want at the moment, and also to check out the media collective that I'm involved in, From the Periphery. There's a number of different podcasts on there on different issues from mutual aid. And I have one called Syria The Inconvenient Revolution, which we've not put out that much content recently, but we're hoping to get more regular content out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate it, and for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.